Before the intervention of unions and the International Diving Schools Association, commercial diving in the oil and gas industry was one of the deadliest professions globally, with mortality rates comparable to a war zone. We're not just talking about dangerous work, but a situation where divers were treated almost like disposable drill components. In the 1970s, the desperate need for energy meant safety took a backseat, sometimes even a third seat. It's astonishing to think oil giants operated in a complete regulatory vacuum, pushing human physiology beyond all limits just for a few more barrels of crude. Maggie, what did that regulatory vacuum mean in human terms?
You're absolutely right, Theodore, and the numbers confirm it in the harshest way. According to historical records analysed by Professor Andy Woods of Cambridge University, mortality rates back then were terrifying. Or we're talking about 2 to 4 deaths per 10,000 divers per year in the UK, while in some cases in the US, those numbers reached 18 deaths. To put that into context, the risk was 40 times higher than the average for all other professions. What was happening in the North Sea and the Gulf of Mexico was effectively a form of metabolic Russian roulette. Companies pressured divers to surface as quickly as possible to avoid losing time for the support vessel, sacrificing the integrity of their vascular system.
That metabolic Russian roulette you mention is a terrifying metaphor. Essentially, divers paid the price of decompression with their lives or permanent disabilities. But how did we transition from this chaos to the creation of strict rules? What role did the International Diving Schools Association, or IDSA, play in this change? Because I imagine oil companies didn't just wake up one day and decide to become philanthropists.
Quite the opposite, Theodore. The change was imposed with blood and hard-fought struggles. The IDSA was founded in 1982 with a very specific purpose: to create common international training standards. Until then, anyone could claim to be a diver with minimal experience. The IDSA introduced the ID card system and modular training units. But the real power behind enforcing the rules came from the unions, such as the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners in America and their counterparts in Norway and Britain. In 1975, unions in the US pressured OSHA, the Workplace Safety Agency, to issue emergency temporary standards. Diving contractors reacted immediately, going to court and managing to temporarily withdraw the rules. But the pressure from workers was now irreversible.
It's interesting that you mention this corporate resistance. We often hear that regulations strangle the economy, but here we're talking about rules that quite literally stopped death. What were these inviolable rules that were finally imposed? What changed in the daily life of a diver working on an oil rig?
The changes were radical and concerned both equipment and procedures. One of the most critical rules was the ban on using simple scuba equipment for commercial work at great depths. Commercial diving now had to be done with surface-supplied air, with helmets equipped with intercoms and multiple air sources. Also, the team of 4 was established. You could no longer dive alone or with just a friend. You needed the working diver, a safety diver on standby at the surface, a diving supervisor, and an attendant. This system ensured that if something went wrong, someone could intervene immediately. Additionally, mandatory monitoring of the diver for at least an hour after the dive was introduced. Many deaths happened because embolism symptoms appeared while the diver was sleeping in their bunk.
This detail about post-dive monitoring shows how insidious the danger is in the hyperbaric environment. But let's talk about saturation diving. That's where the risks multiply. How did unions and organizations like the IDSA manage to tame this technology that allows people to live under pressure for weeks?
Saturation diving was the industry's answer to the need to work at depths of over 50 meters without the huge cost of daily decompression. Divers live in a chamber on the surface, which is under the same pressure as the seabed, and are transported to the worksite in a closed diving bell. Here, the rules became even stricter. The IDSA and IMCA imposed standards for the maintenance of life support systems, the use of helium-oxygen mixtures, and the availability of hyperbaric evacuation systems. That means, if the rig catches fire, divers who are under pressure must be able to escape in a special capsule that maintains pressure. Otherwise, they would die instantly from explosive decompression.
It's terrifying to think that your life depends on a capsule and a series of valves. However, there's a tension here. Oil companies claimed these measures make diving very expensive. Is there any basis to this argument, or was it just an excuse to keep their profits high?
It's the classic cost-benefit dilemma, but in commercial diving, the cost was human lives. Companies did face increased expenses as they had to invest in expensive equipment and employ larger staff teams. However, pressure from unions and the establishment of international standards by the IDSA created what we call a, quote, level playing field, unquote. Once the rules became mandatory for everyone through legislation and insurance requirements, no company could, quote, cut corners on safety to get a job with a lower bid. This was the key: standardization. If you want to work for BP, Shell, or ExxonMobil, you must follow the standards of IMCA or ADCI, otherwise you don't get the contract.
So the market only self-regulated when the pressure became legal and unionized. But let's look at the cultural dimension. These divers of the 70s and 80s were considered the cowboys of the deep. Was there a culture of masculinity that perhaps even despised safety rules? Did the divers themselves initially see unions as something that limited their freedom to take risks for more money?
This is a very subtle point, Theodore. There was indeed this culture of the tough diver who felt invincible, but this mentality began to collapse as deaths became a daily occurrence. When you see your colleagues suffer from osteonecrosis, that is their bones dying because they didn't decompress properly, or dying of hypothermia because the hot water suit stopped working, the romance is lost. Unions also played a role in changing this mindset. They taught divers that professionalism does not mean taking stupid risks, but demanding the equipment that will bring you back to your family. The IDSA contributed to this by modernizing training, turning diving from an art of risk into a science of precision.
You mentioned osteonecrosis and hypothermia. These are not just technical terms, they are physical traumas. I'd like to focus a bit on the technical side of the rules. For example, what do the standards provide for air quality or valve maintenance? How detailed are these rules that stop the deaths?
They are extremely detailed, Theodore. For example, air quality from compressors must be checked at least every 6 months for carbon monoxide, moisture, and oil residue. A small error in filtration can lead to poisoning the diver at 100 meters, where the effect of gases is multiplied due to pressure. Also, every component, from the flexible supply hose, the so-called umbilical, to the helmet, has an expiration date and a strict inspection schedule. One of the rules considered sacred is the check of pressure differentials, the so-called delta P. Many divers lost their lives because they were sucked through small holes in pipes or dams due to the terrifying pressure. Today, IDSA training includes special seminars on identifying such hazards before the diver even enters the water.
All of this sounds like a constant battle between technology and physics. Yet despite the progress, we still see accidents. In 2022, 4 divers lost their lives in a pipeline in Trinidad. Does this mean that oil giants are still finding ways to circumvent the rules, or that there are grey areas in international law?
The accident in Trinidad was a painful reminder that rules are only effective when they're enforced. There, divers were used with SCUBA equipment for a job that required surface supply and strict Delta P protocols. Grey areas exist mainly in regions where the state does not have strong oversight mechanisms. In the North Sea, the Norwegian Norsok and the British HSE are relentless. If a company violates a rule, the penalties are so severe it can close them down. In the developing world, however, oil companies often hire subcontractors who do not follow IDSA standards to reduce costs. Unions are now fighting for global harmonization so that the divers in Nigeria or Brazil has the same protection as the divers in Norway.
It's provocative that the value of human life seems to fluctuate according to geography. If we think about the future, with the rise of remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, is commercial diving heading towards abolition? Is the final solution for zero deaths to take humans out of the water completely?
That is the trend, but it also has its challenges. ROVs can do many tasks, but there are subtle movements such as welding in difficult spots or checking complex valves where human judgment and touch are necessary. The paradox is that the more we use technology, the more specialized and expensive the remaining divers become. The IDSA is already adapting its programs to train divers who will work with robotic systems. The goal is not for the diver to disappear, but to become the conductor of the orchestra at the bottom, remaining in a safe environment as much as possible.
If we had to summarize the big lesson from this historical conflict, what would it be? Is it the power of collective action, or the necessity of technical standardization?
It is the combination of both, Theodore. Without the unions, there would be no political will to enforce the rules. Without the IDSA, there would be no technical language to write these rules. The big lesson is that workplace safety is never a final product, but a continuous process of vigilance. Oil giants stopped counting deaths, not because they wanted to, but because the system made them realize that a dead diver is more expensive than any safety measure. Human life finally became part of the economic equation, not as a cost, but as a value that must be protected.
That's a powerful conclusion. The history of commercial diving teaches us that even in the most hostile environments, organization and knowledge can defeat greed. It is a reminder that every safety rule we take for granted today has a struggle behind it, and unfortunately, often a loss. This story is a powerful illustration of how regulations can literally save lives, and it's worth sharing with someone who believes they are simply bureaucracy.